You are the royal physician. The year is 1834. The halls of the royal palace in Madrid are silent, not with peace, but with tension. King Ferdinand VII is dead, but your duties are not. You've been summoned to his private bedchamber, not to mourn, not to pray, but to preserve something. Something strange, something no textbook ever trained you for. Before you stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina. Her face is pale, her eyes rimmed red, but there's steel beneath the grief. She gives you a request in a trembling voice, and it makes your stomach turn. The air is thick with rosewater and rot as you approach the velvet-draped bed. And there he lies. Even in death, Ferdinand's face holds that smirk, that same cold expression that once issued orders with a flick of the hand. Exiles, punishments, executions. But that's not what stops you. It's what rests under the silk sheets. Not a crown, not a sword, but the part of him history never dared record. A grotesque anomaly. Something the palace staff whispered about behind gloved hands. The same reason servants avoided eye contact. The same reason more than one queen screamed on her wedding night. It had been his burden, his twisted sense of pride, his curse. And now, it was your responsibility. As you begin the delicate preservation, your mind drifts. You remember the rumors of custom-made cushions, of royal physicians summoned in secret, of failed heirs and strange procedures. You're not just handling flesh. You're holding the secret of a broken dynasty. You're preserving more than flesh. You're preserving a symbol, the grotesque emblem of a reign that was itself malformed, bloated, and ruinous to all it touched. Before we descend further into these lost tales of royal agony and forgotten suffering, take a moment to support this journey. Tap the like button, subscribe for more stories buried in shadow, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's haunting, isn't it? That you and I are exploring centuries-old secrets together, separated by miles, yet bound by the same need to uncover what history tried to forget. To understand King Ferdinand VII, you must begin not with his rule, but with his blood. He wasn't cursed by witches. His fate was shaped by centuries of royal ambition. When power meant marrying blood to blood, cousins, uncles, nieces, over generations, the Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs twisted their family tree into a withered, tangled knot. Ferdinand was born into this, a living echo of dynastic decay. He first opened his eyes on October 14, 1784, within the gold-trimmed walls of El Escorial Palace. His parents, King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa, were themselves first cousins, a match forged by strategy, not affection. From the very beginning, the dice were loaded. And as Ferdinand grew, the consequences of that inbreeding began to show, not only in his mind or moods, but in ways far more personal, far more disturbing. By the time he reached adolescence, whispers echoed through the marble corridors. Court physicians, sworn to secrecy, began documenting strange irregularities. Behind closed doors, they studied him, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. One wrote, in cautious Latin, that the prince bore a distortion of the flesh, exaggerated in size and unnatural in form. Another, more blunt, compared it to a walking stick, narrow at the root, grotesquely swollen at the far end. Some accounts, hidden in Vatican vaults and royal archives, speak of physicians who refused to touch him, of queens who wept behind veils, of marriages negotiated not in hope, but in desperation, to secure an heir despite nature's rebellion. It was said that no bed in the royal palace was ever truly quiet, that aids were dismissed in the night, that velvet cushions were replaced with custom-carved supports. And through it all, Ferdinand walked with a crown above his brow and a private torment he could never escape. His body had become both his weapon and his prison. The damage wasn't just physical, It carved into his mind, in a time when noble masculinity was modeled after classical ideals. Lean, restrained, statuesque, young Ferdinand's difference marked him not as blessed, but as monstrous. What modern tales might frame as enviable, his world saw as unnatural. Excess, after all, was considered vulgar, and Ferdinand was excess incarnate. His childhood became a slow unraveling, a quiet, gilded nightmare in silk-lined halls. His father, Charles IV, was a man better suited to hunting dogs than diplomacy. Soft-spoken, indecisive, forever distracted by his rifles and falcons. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was the opposite, fiery, controlling, and scandalously attached to Manuel de Godoy, Spain's shadow ruler and her not-so-secret lover. Ferdinand, still a boy, watched it all unfold, a crown tarnished by public humiliation. He learned early that affection was dangerous, that trust led to disgrace, that power was the only shield. But the most brutal lesson came not from his family's betrayals. It came from the palace itself. The staff whispered when he passed. Some couldn't hold back laughter. Visiting envoys wrote coded letters about Spain's unfortunate heir, cryptic but cruel. He became a courtly spectacle, a silent joke hidden behind curtained doors. Even in rooms full of polished formality, he could feel it. The glances, the murmurs, the carefully chosen silences. And so, shame hardened into something colder, into bitterness, into paranoia. He began to see mockery everywhere, in the bowed heads of servants, in the polite phrases of his tutors, in the strained smiles of royal matches arranged for diplomacy. He began to mistrust joy, to hate ease, to see laughter as a threat. And though many did laugh, it wasn't always for the reasons he imagined. His teachers noticed the shift first. He withdrew from lessons, grew cold, then cruel. Servants were dismissed for imagined offenses. Some vanished entirely. The boy had found a twisted antidote for his vulnerability: control. There is one chilling account preserved in the memoirs of a palace chaplain. A young page, no older than 14, made the mistake of entering Ferdinand's chamber unannounced and caught a glimpse of what no one was meant to see. The prince did not speak. He did not forgive. Instead, he ordered the boy flogged and had his family exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one could bear witness to the heir's secret and walk away untouched. As Ferdinand approached manhood, the true extent of his condition could no longer be ignored. Royal physicians, bound by duty, prepared reports, veiled in Latin, buried in private archives, warning that his future marriages would not be easy, that heirs might prove difficult to produce. But for Ferdinand, this wasn't just a medical dilemma. It was destiny's insult, and he would spend the rest of his life making others pay for it. In the quiet of a locked study, far from the velvet noise of court, one man wrote what others dared not say aloud. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal physician, kept notes that were never meant to surface. Notes that offer us a glimpse into a truth history tried to bury, one not of politics or conquest, but of anatomy. Distorted, nightmarish. He wrote in neat, cautious script, "His Majesty presents a most unnatural configuration." The report continues, its tone clinical, yet unable to mask the unease. At its base, the organ was narrower than expected, no thicker than a man's thumb. But then, in defiance of reason, it widened, dramatically, grotesquely, to proportions that strained all sense of human scale. Even more troubling was its length. Dr. Flores measured it himself, nearly 10 inches at rest, and more under certain conditions. But this wasn't just a matter of size. There was curvature, severe, and along the shaft, inexplicable tissue. Growths with no clear function. No reason, no purpose, just there. Nature had played a cruel joke, and now Spain needed a solution. It was immediately clear to the royal council. Marriage would be dangerous. Producing an heir could prove impossible. Normal intimacy would risk harm, or worse. So, the craftsmen were summoned in secret. Royal upholsterers and woodworkers were instructed to design what court physicians called marital implements. They were careful with their language, but behind closed doors it was understood. These were tools to allow the prince to fulfill his duty without maiming his future queens. Custom-made cushions, angled supports, instruments of obligation wrapped in silk. But no amount of lace or ivory could conceal the truth. What Ferdinand carried was more than a medical abnormality. It was a curse, not just on his body, but on his mind. A daily, visible reminder of everything he hated in himself and in the world around him. And it haunted him far beyond the confines of the royal bed. What medicine could not fix, magic was summoned to heal. Ferdinand became obsessed with transformation, not of the soul, but of the body, of the one part of him he could neither accept nor control. He sought out elixirs, powders, drafts, anything that promised to normalize what nature had distorted. Whispered promises traveled through palace halls, of old Eastern formulas, of jungle roots, of alchemical solutions found in the shadowed corners of the world. Quacks arrived under cover of night. Foreign physicians, backroom alchemists, con men in silk gloves. All offered miracles. None delivered truth. The prince drank concoctions of crushed pearls and powdered rhinoceros horn. He swallowed rare herbs from distant mountains, believing they would purify his blood, tame his body, restore balance. Some brews claimed to reduce what had grown beyond control. Others promised to boost his virility, as though force alone could overcome design. None worked, but Ferdinand couldn't stop. Each failure only deepened his desperation. He became a vessel for false hope, pouring fortune after fortune into potions that stung the tongue and stained the glass, but did nothing to quiet the whispers in his mind. And then, duty called. In 1702, at just 18, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The arrangement was political, sealed long before they understood what it meant to belong to one another. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid young, hopeful, and full of dreams. She had been raised on stories of royal romance, of shared glances in candlelit ballrooms, of soft hands and whispered promises. She knew nothing of the thing that awaited her behind those carved oak doors. She would learn soon enough. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. Maria Antonia had heard the name whispered with reverence across the courts of Europe. She imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince, handsome, noble, destined for greatness. And at first, it seemed she had. Their wedding was a masterpiece of ceremony. The cathedral blazed with candlelight. Organs thundered through the marble. Crowds filled the streets of Madrid, tossing flowers and singing beneath royal balconies. Maria Antonia was radiant, intelligent, kind-hearted, and hopeful. Ferdinand played his part too. In public, he was attentive, graceful, even charming. No sign of shadows beneath the crown, but royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. That's where the illusion unraveled. The first warning came not from the groom, but from his valet. He approached the ladies-in-waiting with a strange request. The royal bedchamber would require special preparations, pillows, custom-made, oils and ointments arranged just so, and other implements, ones the women didn't recognize. They were told it was all perfectly standard for royalty. It was not. Maria Antonia, like most young royal brides, had been raised in cloistered innocence. Her education was courtly and clean. Languages, music, piety. The mysteries of marriage had been explained in whispers, vague and trembling. She was unprepared for what waited behind the bedchamber door. When Ferdinand entered, he removed his robes without a word, and then she saw him. The princess's scream split the walls. One of her ladies would later write, in a letter never meant for history books. Her Majesty shrieked as though she'd seen the devil himself. She backed into the corner, pale as snow, shouting, "Monster, monster," again and again, until we feared she had gone mad. What she saw was beyond comprehension, not simply in scale, but in form. The stories had hinted at it. The servants had whispered. The doctors had measured. But no rumor could prepare a young woman for the truth. There was no grace in it, no symmetry. It was bent and swollen in unnatural ways, the structure uneven, the proportions alien, with markings and growths that seemed almost wrong. Not human. Not quite. Terror gave way to silence, then to disbelief. That night did not unfold like a fairy tale. It did not begin with soft words or gentle touches. It began with the arrival of court physicians. Specially trained attendants entered the bridal chamber, not to witness, but to explain. They spoke in hushed voices to the horrified princess, detailing what would be required of her. The custom cushions were placed beneath royal linens. Oils were warmed and applied by gloved hands. The entire process was more like surgery than a celebration of union. There are letters, buried deep in family archives, that describe the scene with clinical sorrow. One physician wrote, "The prince required elevation through crafted supports. The act could not proceed without careful alignment. Her Majesty wept through the entire attempt." There was no joy that night, only ritual, obligation, and fear. The marriage had begun, not with love, but with pain. And for Maria Antonia, that bedroom would become both throne and prison. Even with all the royal modifications, the cushions, the salves, the strange contraptions, the procedure remained a torment, not just for Maria Antonia, but for Ferdinand as well. The effort to shield himself from injury during intimacy had turned the act itself into something cold, mechanical, and disturbing. A routine designed not for love, but survival. To endure it, Maria Antonia was given laudanum, a tincture of opium and wine, at first in careful doses, then in desperate amounts. Her body may have gone numb, but her mind fractured. The marriage became a recurring nightmare, a ritual wrapped in velvet, repeated behind locked doors. Each time, the same performance. Ferdinand would summon his private doctors. They would prepare the bedchamber like a surgical theater, arranging supports, heating oils, adjusting angles. Maria Antonia, pale and trembling, would be dosed once again. Just enough to keep her quiet, but not unresponsive. Afterward, they would part without words, she to her chambers, to weep, to withdraw, to take more of the drug. He to his, brooding, suspicious, convinced that her discomfort masked betrayal. No child came, and with every failed attempt, Ferdinand's bitterness grew. He began to suspect that her fear, her visible discomfort, was the true reason for their failure, that something in her was resisting him, blocking his legacy. So he devised a solution. Court records, buried deep in royal inventories, speak of new commissions sent to the palace artisans. The same men who crafted his saddles and hunting gear were now asked to produce something else: leather, silk, metal fittings, restraints, not for punishment, not even for pleasure, but to ensure stillness, compliance, silence. They were custom made to hold the queen in position during these royal encounters, preventing her from recoiling, from turning away, from expressing the revulsion she could no longer hide. No love could bloom in such a garden. What was meant to secure a dynasty had become a prison of flesh and power, a legacy not of heirs, but of scars. As time dragged on and the silence of the nursery deepened, Ferdinand turned to the skies. he became obsessed with timing, not through science, but through superstition. Court astronomers were summoned, astrologers were consulted, and soon, men of darker persuasion entered the palace. They came cloaked in incense and riddles, promising the alignment of stars, the unlocking of wombs, the bending of fate. The royal bedchamber, once a stage for suffering, now became a theater of ritual. Charms were worn, candles were lit, diagrams were drawn on parchment and skin. One figure, a wandering mystic claiming to be from the East, captured the king's attention. His accent was theatrical, his robes strange, but his words were what Ferdinand most desired. He told the king that his unusual form was not a curse, but a divine gift. A dragon sign, he said, a blessing from the heavens, misunderstood by men, but revered in ancient lands. All that was needed, the mystic claimed, was the right series of sacred acts. And so, for 3 months, the palace bore witness to strange ceremonies. Incense curled through corridors, chants echoed behind sealed doors. Positions were attempted, not for love, but for destiny. Maria Antonia endured it all in silence, eyes dulled by laudanum and grief. Then, against all expectation, she conceived. The court exploded in joy. Ferdinand's mood shifted. He smiled in public again. Hope, for once, seemed to breathe within the marble walls. But it would not last. In 1804, 4 months into the pregnancy, the queen began to bleed. The physicians did what they could, but the outcome was certain. The child was lost. The official cause was delicate, a strain upon Her Majesty's fragile constitution. But behind closed doors, among the doctors, the truth was whispered. The physical toll had been too great. Her body, already burdened by fear and unnatural strain, could not carry life to term. Still, Ferdinand refused to surrender. Again the rituals resumed. Again the astrologers recharted the moon. Again the queen conceived. But in 1805, the second pregnancy ended. This time more violently, more quickly. Maria Antonia collapsed in her chambers. Blood stained her linens. She wept until she couldn't speak. The physicians no longer pretended to believe in fate. They had seen too much. They understood the price of royal obsession. The cradle remained empty, and the palace grew quieter still. This time, the child almost came into the world. Maria Antonia carried the pregnancy to its final months. The court held its breath. The physicians prepared. The nursery was furnished in soft blues and golds. And then, it happened. The labor was brutal. A night soaked in screams and blood. The corridors of the palace echoed with the sound of suffering. Servants wept behind doors. Doctors barked orders. Prayers were whispered to stone saints. The child was lost, and the queen nearly followed. Her body survived, but her spirit did not. After that night, Maria Antonia was no longer truly present. She wandered the palace halls like a shadow wrapped in lace. Her addiction to laudanum deepened. Her voice grew thin, her eyes glassy. She smiled rarely, and only when she was alone, lost in memories no one else could reach. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the black depths of his soul. Instead of sorrow, he offered suspicion. Instead of comfort, he cast blame. He accused her of sabotage, of secretly preventing conception, of taking unknown potions to end their unborn children, of aligning with liberal traitors who didn't want a true Catholic heir. In private, he whispered to his advisors, "She is working against Spain." In public, he grew cold, ceremonial, distant. These accusations, barbed and unrelenting, broke what remained of her mind. Maria Antonia began to believe them. She became convinced that she was cursed, that her body had been marked by some ancient sin. She knelt in the palace chapel for hours, day after day, begging forgiveness for crimes she could not name. She wept for children she could never hold. And then, in May of 1807, just 21 years old. She died. The official report said fever. They added complications from a fragile constitution, but those who served her knew the truth. She had died of sorrow, of violation, of despair. She had been unmade, not by war or disease, but by the very crown she was meant to uphold. Even in death, Ferdinand would not let her go quietly. Rumors spread like smoke that she had not died naturally, that her failing health had been encouraged, that someone had slipped something into her final draft. And when the palace apothecary, the only man who had prepared her medicines, was found dead in his chambers days later, those whispers became roars. Some said it was poison, others called it justice, but nothing could change the ending. Maria Antonia, queen, child bride, ghost, was gone, buried beneath marble, forgotten by power, but not by the shadows, because some wounds outlive the flesh. After the queen's death, the palace apothecary was found lifeless in his quarters. He left behind a letter, handwritten, sealed in haste, but it never reached the light of day. Ferdinand's agents seized it within the hour. It vanished into the vaults of royal secrecy. Some whispered it was a confession, a list of poisons administered under orders. Others believed it revealed the true extent of Ferdinand's condition, or the impossible rituals forced upon Maria Antonia until her body gave out. We will never know. But what came next was clear. Ferdinand, draped in black, wept in public, attended services, laid wreaths. But behind the scenes, he was already planning his next move. Within weeks, inquiries were sent across Europe, not for beauty, not for alliance, but for fertility. He sought women who had proven they could bear children, widows, mothers, women with wombs already tested by history. The doctors, meanwhile, resumed their dreadful work. If there was to be a second marriage, it had to be different, less painful, less catastrophic. They experimented with new devices, marital instruments of increasing complexity. There were even whispered attempts at surgical alteration. Historians rarely speak of this. The records are vague, incomplete, perhaps deliberately destroyed. But the goal was obvious: make the king manageable, or at least make his future wives better prepared. By now, Ferdinand was no longer simply disturbed. He was transformed. The trauma of his first marriage, combined with his lifelong shame and obsessive control, had created something darker. A man who could no longer see others as human, only as instruments or enemies. Maria Antonia had been a tool that failed. His subjects were tools for maintaining power. His enemies? Obstacles to be broken. He tested the limits of his authority. Servants who caught glimpses of his body were not merely dismissed. They vanished. Guards who whispered behind his back were reassigned to the bleakest corners of the empire, where disease and war did the king's dirty work. And always, behind those cold eyes, was suspicion. Ferdinand grew obsessed with the idea that people were laughing at him. In salons, in drawing rooms, in the kitchens of his own palace. He wasn't entirely wrong, but his response became unhinged. He began keeping lists, names of those who smirked too long, who bowed too slowly, who dared speak out of turn. Plans were drawn, punishments imagined, revenge plotted for a future he believed was his by right. By 1807, the transformation was nearly complete. He had become the dark center of a conspiracy. A group of nobles and military men, desperate to remove the feeble King Charles IV and his corrupt minister, Manuel de Godoy, saw in Ferdinand a symbol of restoration, a return to strength. They called themselves Los Fernandinos. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. But they did not understand what they were unleashing. This was not a savior. This was not a prince born to heal Spain. This was a man hollowed by humiliation, shaped by suffering, and now filled with vengeance. a king in waiting forged not by duty, but by deformity, addiction, and the cold arithmetic of control. And his reign was about to begin. The men who gathered around Ferdinand in 1807 believed they were choosing a savior. They spoke of patriotism, of restoration. They whispered that Spain, once proud and mighty, could rise again, with the prince as its shining sword. They flooded the salons and city squares with carefully curated rumors that Ferdinand was brilliant, that he was pious, that he would cleanse the nation of corruption. But behind the marble masks, those closest to him knew the truth. They saw the outbursts, the cruelty, the erratic behavior behind locked doors. They had watched the boy become a man, and the man become a ghost in a crown. Still, they placed their bets. In October 1707, their plot came to life. It would later be called the El Escorial Conspiracy, named for the palace that birthed both Spain's monarchs and its darkest secrets. Ferdinand had reached out in secret to Napoleon Bonaparte, offering allegiance in exchange for power. He would depose his own father, King Charles IV, and Godoy, the minister he had long despised. In their place, he would rise. But the plan failed. The court uncovered everything. And Ferdinand? He did what he had always done when fear overcame pride. He begged. He turned on his allies, named every conspirator, provided letters, details, meeting locations. He sobbed before his parents, the same parents he had plotted to dethrone. While his co-conspirators were imprisoned, exiled, ruined, Ferdinand walked free. This betrayal would not be his last. It would become his legacy. He used people like implements, and when they cracked, he discarded them. But while he maneuvered through the halls of power, his body continued to rebel. The physicians recorded it in hidden journals, locked in the vaults of the Royal Archive. They noted that Ferdinand's condition, once merely grotesque, had become unmanageable. The deformity was worsening, changing, the proportions more extreme, new irregularities forming, tissue growth that defied logic. Some modern historians suggest a rare hormonal disorder, megaloa perhaps, a condition in which certain organs continue growing throughout adulthood, unchecked by nature or medicine. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Ferdinand's needs were outgrowing what the court could discreetly accommodate. He would require new devices, new rituals, and wives, not just willing, but pliant. Women who could endure or be reshaped. The throne awaited, but so did the crown of bone and blood he carried between shame and obsession. This was no longer a man. This was a monarch forged in humiliation, driven by betrayal, and now spiraling into madness. And soon, Spain would kneel not before a savior, but a broken god in velvet robes. Silence was bought and enforced. Those who helped construct the secret devices for the royal chambers were paid handsomely and warned harshly. But gold does not soothe the conscience, and fear, once planted, grows deep. Within years, several artisans connected to the projects were found dead, their bodies discovered in rivers, forests, and alleys. No suspects, no investigations. Whispers began. Had they spoken? Had Ferdinand ensured they never would? In 1808, fate added its own humiliation. Napoleon invaded Spain, the Bourbon monarchy crumbled, and Ferdinand, the desired one, the supposed savior, was forced to abdicate. His crown was taken, his mask was torn away, and then he was made a prisoner. The future king was sent to Château de Valençay, a place of luxury, yes, but also a cage. And the French, they knew everything. Their spies had long kept files on the Spanish court. They had gathered more than political secrets. They knew of Ferdinand's condition, the surgeries, the restraints, the nightly rituals behind velvet curtains. But unlike his Spanish doctors, the French were not bound by royal etiquette. They were scientists, and Ferdinand was no longer a king. They examined him without shame, recorded measurements, took sketches, probed, tested, observed. Their notes, buried for centuries in Napoleonic archives, described something not quite human. One report compared the organ in question to a mythical creature's limb. Vast in scale, distorted in shape, riddled with inconsistencies, no single disorder could explain. But together, they called it a perfect storm of inherited mutations, a grotesque mosaic created by centuries of inbreeding and isolation. And while Ferdinand endured these humiliations in silk-draped confinement, his country bled. Across the hills and trenches of Spain, soldiers died in his name. Men with cracked boots, frost-bitten fingers, and empty stomachs, all proclaiming loyalty to a man they believed would save the nation. They did not know. They did not know that in exile, their king was writing letters, not to generals, not to the people, but to princesses, to duchesses, to widows. One by one across Europe, he sent out carefully inked pleas. Begging for brides, he wrote of lineage, of duty. But between the lines, always, was the question, will you accept me as I am? His obsession remained unchanged. Not justice, not nationhood, but reproduction. Legacy. More than anything, Ferdinand wanted a new wedding night, a new heir, a new chance to outwit the cruel joke written into his flesh. And so, while Spain burned in revolt, while its people starved and bled, Ferdinand sat beneath crystal chandeliers, dreaming of silk sheets and custom pillows. Then, in 1814, after 6 long years, the chains were removed. Ferdinand returned, and the crowds that greeted him were vast, tens of thousands, cheering, crying. They didn't know. They welcomed not a liberator, but a man stitched together by trauma, driven by obsession, and molded into something far more terrifying than a tyrant. They welcomed a king, but what they received was a storm. They wept, they threw flowers, they fell to their knees. The streets of Madrid overflowed with joy as Ferdinand's carriage returned from exile. Children, born during the blood-soaked war, glimpsed for the first time the man their fathers had died to restore. Even the stones beneath the wheels seemed to sing. But behind the royal wave and practiced smile, Ferdinand's mind was not on governance, not on rebuilding a broken country, not even on gratitude. His thoughts, as always, were elsewhere. He needed a new wife, someone fertile, young, obedient, someone who could finally end the curse by giving him an heir. The throne was his again, but it meant nothing without a legacy. And so began the decade that historians would later call ominous. But the true darkness did not lie in laws or wars. It festered in the royal bedchamber. Ferdinand's personal torment had now become a national affliction. The king's first act after reclaiming his power was not to meet his ministers, but to commission a new set of marital devices, elegant, disturbing contraptions crafted by artisans across Europe and beyond. Agents were dispatched to Germany, to Italy, to Istanbul, searching for masters of discreet craftsmanship, devices for delicate situations, solutions for royal impossibilities. What returned to Madrid was a collection of grotesque ingenuity, hidden in locked chests, labeled in coded language, locked away in the deepest corners of the palace. Soon, Ferdinand chose his second queen, Maria Isabel of Portugal, 19, another cousin, one more link in the chain of royal inbreeding that had forged this dynasty of broken bodies and haunted minds. She arrived with soft eyes and a hopeful heart, trained in courtesy, dressed in lace, prepared for duty, but not for what awaited her. Her ladies had been warned, in vague terms. "Preparations will be necessary," the court physician said. "Her Majesty must be brave." But no language could prepare a young girl for what stood behind the altar. The wedding was a spectacle. Ferdinand stood in cloth of gold, drenched in sweat. His hands trembled. His gaze darted. He had spent the last 7 nights in consultation, not with generals, but with alchemists, surgeons, and a foreign specialist cloaked in mystery, rumored to have once treated Ottoman princes with difficult afflictions. But all of it, the science, the magic, the engineering, would fail. That night, in the darkness of the royal bed, history repeated itself. There were no soft whispers, no sweet vows, only a sound that chilled the halls, the scream of a girl who had just seen her worst nightmare become flesh. Servants spoke of bloodied sheets, shattered chairs, a chamber that looked more like a battlefield than a bridal suite. What had happened was not union, it was survival. Maria Isabel was never the same. She developed a stutter, a twitch in her hands, and a gaze that avoided every mirror. Her ladies recorded episodes of uncontrollable sobbing, violent tremors, and nightmares, where she cried out warnings to unseen monsters. She called him it, never he. Ferdinand saw her fear and took it as insult. He, the king, el deseado, the desired one, could not bear the suggestion that he was anything but perfect. His mind, already steeped in paranoia, cracked further. He became convinced that his new queen was mocking him, not just in thought, but in secret letters to foreign courts. He imagined plots. He imagined betrayal. He saw treason in every flinch of her eye. And so, the mask of kingship slipped again. What remained beneath was a man drowning in obsession, a ruler forged in pain, and a husband whose touch left scars no crown could hide. He began reading her letters, not just some, all of them. He ordered her food inspected for poison, her chambers searched for signs of betrayal. Even her prayers were not trusted. Ferdinand's obsession had metastasized, no longer confined to the bedroom. What began as a grotesque physical burden now ruled his entire court. Spain itself began to rot under the weight of one man's silent humiliation. The pressure to produce an heir had become a national obsession. Physicians were summoned, anatomists invited, and, unthinkably, circus performers too, claiming expertise in unusual arrangements. The royal bedchamber transformed, not into a sanctuary, but a theater, a laboratory of agony and experimentation. There is a diary, hidden for over a century, written by one of the palace doctors. In its yellowing pages lies a scene that defies belief. Ferdinand, desperate beyond dignity, had invited foreign experts to witness his private attempts at conception. German scholars, French doctors. They stood, pen in hand, beside the royal bed. They observed, they recorded, they drew sketches, and when they left, they took their notes to the lecture halls of Europe. Across the continent, Ferdinand's anatomy became a topic of academic curiosity. His failures? A spectacle. And the Queen? Maria Isabel, already fading, now dissolved entirely. She stopped eating. Her skin clung to bone. She no longer screamed. She no longer flinched. She simply stared, hollow-eyed, silent, through anyone who approached her. The servants began calling her La Sombra, the shadow. A young girl made into a ghost, trapped in velvet hallways she would never escape. But the consequences of this royal nightmare stretched far beyond the palace walls. In the Americas, revolution burned. From Mexico to Argentina, rebels pointed to Spain's cursed monarch, a man incapable of producing heirs, of commanding respect, of holding his own nation together, and declared his rule a divine error. Ferdinand's body had become the symbol of empire in decay. Revolutionary pamphlets, smuggled into ports and plazas, depicted him not as king, but as a broken thing, powerless in bed, powerless on the throne. Ferdinand's response was swift and cruel. he launched purges across the kingdom. Anyone suspected of whispering about the king's condition was interrogated. The Inquisition, restored by Ferdinand himself, now investigated not heresy, but gossip. A single offhand comment between spouses could lead to torture or death. Spaniards began watching their words, then their thoughts. In the palace, the king's obsession with secrecy turned absurd. He ordered hidden corridors carved into the walls, allowing him to slip unseen from his chambers to the queen's. Mirrors were placed at angles to catch eavesdroppers. Spies walked the gardens and staircases, listening for laughter that lasted too long. And through it all, Maria Isabel continued to unravel. She began experiencing what the physicians called phantom pregnancies, moments where her belly swelled, her moods shifted, her body convinced itself that life was forming inside it. It wasn't. But for brief days or weeks, the king believed. He would touch her stomach with trembling fingers. He would call for musicians. He would whisper to her belly in Latin prayers. And when the truth revealed itself once more, when no child came, the silence returned. Heavier than before, sharper, Spain waited, the queen withered, and the king's madness deepened. Her body never carried a child, but it tried to. Again and again, Maria Isabel's form betrayed itself, swelling, shifting, aching, not with life, but with hope. False hope. Phantom pregnancies, they called them. And still, the king believed. Servants whispered of how Ferdinand paced outside her chamber doors during those weeks, sometimes praying, sometimes cursing, sometimes whispering to no one, begging heaven to rewrite biology. They watched their monarch unravel. As each illusion dissolved, he slipped deeper into shadow. When the truth emerged, no heartbeat, no child, Ferdinand collapsed into silent fury. Government meetings were canceled, decrees delayed, ministers ignored. Spain froze, not from war or famine, but from one man's unbearable disappointment. And then, in 1818, Maria Isabel was gone. The official diagnosis: nervous exhaustion. The quiet phrase reserved for women whose souls had simply let go. But in Fombourg, the notes of her attendants, darker suspicions lingered. Self-starvation, bruises without explanation, broken glass hidden beneath folded gowns. Her confessor claimed her final words were whispered with a cracked smile. "Thank you, Lord, for setting me free." Ferdinand did not mourn. He hunted, convinced his wife had been taken from him, not by fate, but by enemies. The king ordered multiple autopsies. He demanded poison be found. When none was, he demanded it be looked for again. Several of Maria Isabel's ladies-in-waiting were arrested. Some vanished into prison cells and were never seen again. Grief and paranoia merged into one thing, a monstrous thing that fed on everyone around him. Even her funeral became a spectacle of obsession. Ferdinand insisted on overseeing every detail. He viewed the body again, and again, and again. He touched her cold skin, whispered to it. He muttered about wasted potential, the seed denied, the betrayal inside her blood. He ordered a death mask cast from her face, pale, waxen, silent, and placed it in his private chambers. There, visitors reported hearing him speak to it, converse, debate, beg, as if some fragment of her remained trapped in plaster, just waiting to answer him. But the queen was gone, and all that remained was a man crowned in madness, a kingdom ruled by a shadow, and a silence more terrifying than any scream. Grief could not slow him. Madness could not delay him. Within weeks of Maria Isabel's burial, the wheels were already turning. Letters sent. Diplomatic channels opened. Ferdinand still needed an heir. And death, even royal death, was no excuse for delay. But the world was watching now. His reputation, once whispered behind curtains, had become legend. The failed marriages, the funerals, the rumors of locked doors and bloodied sheets. One by one, noble houses across Europe declined. Some brides withdrew quietly, advised by physicians who had once served inside the Spanish palace. Others made demands never before seen in royal negotiations: separate chambers, armed guards, the right to refuse certain duties. Ferdinand's curse had become more than personal. It was diplomatic, a threat to alliances, a stain on the crown. But at last, they found her. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, 24, educated, poised, and from a family on the brink of financial collapse. They needed Spain more than Spain needed them. And so, despite the warnings, she came. When she arrived in Madrid in 1819, the court barely raised a cheer. The third wedding was a tired ritual, stripped of splendor, hollow in joy. No grand procession, no sea of dignitaries, just the weight of expectation and the scent of dread. Maria Josepha was no naive girl. She had been briefed by doctors in detail. She arrived with her own physician, her own equipment, even her own medications. She approached her role not with romance, but with resolve. This was not a gay marriage. It was a clinical trial. Ferdinand, now older and more bitter, complied. The royal bedchamber was transformed once more, not into a bridal suite, but a medical ward. Every encounter was scheduled, supervised, measured. Ointments were applied, supports adjusted, records kept. Maria Josepha wrote everything down. In private journals, now lost to time, she noted durations, reactions, failures. The reports read like a surgeon's ledger, and cold, precise, bloodless. This was the only way to survive. Emotion had destroyed her predecessors. Science, she believed, might protect her. But some things, science cannot fix. Ferdinand's condition remained as it always had: unyielding, grotesque, inescapable. And so their marriage settled into a pattern of polite silence and clinical failure. He watched her, she measured him. And outside, Spain waited, ruled by a ghost of a man, still searching for a legacy his body refused to give. But it was her calm that broke him. Maria Josepha's clinical detachment, her steady hands and cold eyes, infuriated Ferdinand more than screams or tears ever had. Where Isabel had cowered, Maria observed. Where others cried, she recorded. To Ferdinand, she was no longer a wife. She was a spy. He became convinced she was sending coded reports, not to lovers, but to doctors, to governments, to foreign enemies. He imagined Saxon physicians laughing in candlelit rooms, reading her descriptions, sketching his failures, turning his pain into medical study. And all the while, Spain crumbled. One by one, the American colonies declared independence. Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Peru. The empire that had once fed on gold now choked on dust. Centuries of power gone. And what was the king doing? He was not reading military dispatches. He was not meeting with generals. He was meeting with physicians. Entire cabinet meetings were postponed because the king was having a difficult week. Laws were delayed while new techniques were tested. Budgets ignored as foreign consultants were flown in, at great cost, to experiment behind velvet doors. The people, once grateful for his return, began to understand the truth. Spain had not been restored. It had been cursed. Revolution simmered in the streets. Bandits ruled the countryside. And in Madrid, the crown obsessed over the one thing it could never control. Europe laughed. Newspapers in Vienna and Paris ran satirical sketches, the king surrounded by doctors, devices, and maps of his own body. Spain, a nation defined by a ruler's shame. And then, a miracle. In 1829, after a decade of clinical attempts, Maria Josepha conceived. The court stood still. Messengers galloped through the night with news. Ambassadors sent coded dispatches. Even enemies paused. Could it be? Had the king finally triumphed over his curse? Some claimed it was divine mercy. Others whispered about medical breakthroughs. And some, the cruelest, suggested the Timbre child wasn't his at all. Ferdinand's reaction was immediate and unhinged. He surrounded the queen with guards, blessed her rooms with every priest, monk, and mystic in Madrid, imported doctors from across Europe, banished any servant who had ever spoken too loudly. He believed the child was in danger, that foreign agents would poison the womb, that devils would enter through the walls. His fear became ritual. Each day, he visited Maria's chamber. He lit candles. He wept. He whispered to her stomach. But miracles come at a price. In the 7th month, the queen began to bleed. The physicians were helpless. The techniques they knew had no answers for this. Maria clutched her belly in agony. The servants prayed. The halls fell silent. And the king. The king stood motionless, gripping the doorframe, whispering just one word over and over. No. The miracle unraveled in blood. Maria Josefa was suffering from placental abruption, a condition modern medicine could have treated. But this was no modern court. This was Ferdinand's palace, where doctors shared space with mystics and alchemists argued with surgeons, where ritual trumped science, where reason was suffocated by fear. On May 18, 1829, the queen went into premature labor. What followed was carnage. Ferdinand insisted on personally overseeing the birth. He had no training, no knowledge, no sense, only obsession. He hovered over the physicians, interrupted them, overruled them, and when the child came, a daughter, she breathed only for a few hours. Maria Josefa survived the delivery, but not the aftermath. 3 weeks later, she was gone. The official cause, childbed fever. But behind palace doors, the truth was whispered. It was not just infection, it was despair. The queen had nothing left to live for. And Ferdinand? He broke. He refused to bury them. Either of them. He ordered the bodies kept warm. Ordered more prayers. Ordered resurrections. Physicians were forced to apply useless treatments. Holy men chanted over decaying flesh. The air soured. The walls absorbed the rot. The palace became a tomb. For nearly a week, death lived beside the king. Only when the stench became unbearable did Ferdinand allow the corpses to be removed. He commissioned 2 more death masks, one for the queen, one for the child, and placed them alongside the masks of his previous wives. There, in the shadows of his private chamber, he sat, hour after hour, speaking to them, touching them, as if they might answer. The King of Spain had become a ghost, a hollow vessel surrounded by plaster faces and fading hopes. But fate, cruel as ever, had one last joke. Later that same year, in 1829, at the age of 45, Ferdinand remarried. His advisors, desperate to stabilize the monarchy, arranged a union with Maria Cristina of Naples. She arrived with soft manners, subtle charm, and a secret. She was already pregnant by another man. The court knew, the nobles knew, even the servants whispered. But Ferdinand chose not to know. The wedding proceeded like a farce, the bride's belly already showing, and the king, shattered and childless for decades, called it divine intervention. In 1830, a daughter was born, Isabella II, and the lie became law. Spain cheered. The dynasty appeared saved. But behind palace doors, the illusion poisoned everything. Ferdinand knew the child wasn't his. Maria Cristina knew he knew, but neither dared break the spell. Their marriage became a pageant of deception. She performed affection. He performed belief. But deep inside, Ferdinand still wanted what had eluded him his entire life, a child of his own flesh. So, the rituals began again. The same doctors, the same devices, the same silent screams. He tried and failed and tried again. His body now aging, sagging, brittle, a monument to ruined legacy. And as the years wore on, his paranoia spiraled once more. He began storming into Maria Christina's chambers unannounced, flanked by guards, tearing open doors, searching wardrobes, accusing, demanding, whispering of plots and poisons. He feared betrayal at every corner, feared that everyone, even his wife, was mocking him behind closed doors. And they were. By the end, Ferdinand VII had become what history feared most, not a tyrant, not a fool, but a man broken so completely that even his crown could not hold him together. A king eaten alive by his own legacy. A palace haunted not by ghosts, but by the living. The palace no longer slept. Each night, the queen's ladies-in-waiting lay in their beds with eyes open, not from dreams, but from dread. Any moment, the door could burst open, and in would come the king, wild-eyed, trembling, breathing accusations of betrayal. Ferdinand's midnight raids had become routine. He burst into chambers with guards at his back, barking questions no one could answer. Who sent that letter? Why was she whispering during dinner? What was hidden beneath the cushion? They never knew what would set him off, and what terrified them more was that neither did he. His obsession with surveillance mutated into something grotesque. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between his chambers and Maria Christina's, crude, jagged tunnels carved through centuries-old stone. Servants began seeing it, a glint of light, a glimmer of movement, the king's eye pressed to the wall, watching while she nursed the child, while she prayed, while she sat, doing nothing. Maria Christina knew. She learned to keep her back to the wall, to sit still, to breathe quietly, to speak in tones too low to carry. She was no longer a queen. She was a specimen, a captive. Even meals became rituals of suspicion. Every dish had to be tasted, but not just tasted, timed. Ferdinand demanded a full 30-minute delay between tasting and serving. Slow poison, he muttered. Servants stood in line, trembling. He stared at them, eyes narrowed, breath shallow, searching their faces for twitches, gasps, any sign of the invisible enemy he feared most, death by betrayal. Some tasters collapsed, not from poison, but from fear, and each time, the king grew more certain that someone was trying to kill him. Maria Christina, trapped inside this waking nightmare, began to break. Her letters home, intercepted by royal spies, grew darker. "I feel eyes in every mirror," she wrote. "Even the silence feels monitored. I am inside a glass cage. Each breath is weighed, each glance recorded." She no longer trusted her servants, no longer trusted her own hands. She jumped at shadows. She spoke to no one unless necessary. Her days were planned like prison routines. And Ferdinand? He turned on the court. Guards were replaced daily. Loyalty oaths rewritten weekly. No one was safe. Cabinet ministers were subjected to twisted loyalty tests. The king would make one statement to one man and the opposite to another. Then wait to see who repeated what. He called it strategy, but it was madness. And Spain. Spain waited, trembling beneath a king who ruled not with power, but with suspicion. A kingdom inside a looking glass, a monarchy run by whispers, and at the center of it all, a broken man, staring through walls. By the 1830s, the Spanish court was no longer a palace. It was a stage, a theater of whispers, glances, and survival. Gone were the days of elegance, of courtly grace, and diplomatic ceremony. Now ministers stood on shifting ground, each step a test. Ferdinand had devised a game, cruel, silent, and inescapable. He would issue contradictory orders. He would tell one minister one thing and another the opposite. Then he would wait. Who would correct him? Who would remain silent? Who would dare question the king? To contradict him was treason. To obey him was dangerous. Everyone played and no one won. Courtiers learned to speak in code, to avoid eye contact, to bow precisely, never too low, never too late. Friendships dissolved overnight. Alliances were forged in fear. A careless word could mean exile, or worse. But it was his daughter, his miracle, that undid him. Little Isabella, the girl who would be queen, the child born of another man, and yet crowned as Ferdinand's own. He both loved her and loathed her. He would sit for hours, staring at her tiny face, searching for hints of himself, a glance, a brow line, a shape of nose. Then he would stare at portraits of Maria Christina's rumored lovers, then at himself, then at her again. The question devoured him. Whose child is this truly? He commissioned artists to paint Isabella repeatedly, not in grand poses, but in forensic detail. He gathered old paintings of himself, of the queen, of courtiers past and present, laying them side by side like evidence in a trial that would never end. He turned to genealogists, to physicians. "Prove she is mine," he demanded. And so they tried. They wrote reports laced in ambiguity, twisted enough to appease him, vague enough to avoid the scaffold. The archives still hold them, lines upon lines of scientific riddles, truth bent into survival. And Maria Christina? She endured, but barely. Ferdinand assigned spies to watch her every move, not just her letters, her expressions as she wrote them. What made her frown? What made her pause? What made her smile? He wanted logs, pages of data, how long she prayed, what books she read, whom she spoke to, what she wore. He was building a palace of control, brick by brick, surveillance by surveillance, and she held herself together by threadbare grace. She walked with dignity. She smiled when needed. She kissed the child. She greeted the court. She reigned under glass, a queen in a cage, and the king. He sat beneath painted ceilings and velvet tapestries, haunted by what he could not father, crushed by what he had claimed, and surrounded by the ghosts of 3 wives, 1 daughter, and a lie wearing a crown. She learned how to survive, not by resistance, but by performance. Maria Christina compartmentalized herself, smiling in public, shrinking in private. A queen, yes, but also an actress. Her private diary, discovered centuries later behind a false wall in her chambers, tells the story in her own hand. I must never break character, not even in my dreams. To live under Ferdinand was to live on a stage where the audience never left and the spotlight never dimmed. But the king's madness could no longer be hidden behind the palace gates. Foreign ambassadors began sending warnings back to their governments that Spain, once a proud empire, was now ruled by delusion. Marriage alliances stalled, trade agreements wavered. No one trusted a monarch who saw ghosts behind curtains and traitors in compliments. Ferdinand's paranoia infected every gesture. When Maria Christina asked to redecorate her rooms, he believed she was crafting hiding places for poison. When a courtier admired her gown, he suspected secret codes. Even her prayers, long, tearful, devout, became suspect. Is she praying for me? Or against me? The cost of this fear was staggering. The treasury, already fragile, was bled dry, not by war, but by whispers. He built hidden corridors through the palace, installed bells that rang when drawers were opened, maintained rotating shifts of tasters, guards, and cleaners, ensuring no group could conspire. The court became a machine of surveillance, and the machine devoured itself. Ferdinand began to unravel under the weight of his own creation. Physicians recorded the toll. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't digest. He trembled constantly, a man trapped in a cage he had locked from the inside. The line between imagination and reality no longer existed. Even birthdays became battlegrounds. He watched flower arrangements for signs of rebellion, scrutinized gift wrap for hidden messages, laughed when others didn't, cried when no one else was watching. Even his brother Don Carlos, loyal for decades, was investigated. And worst of all was the daughter, Isabella. He could not let go. Ferdinand both loved her and feared her. She was everything he had ever wanted, and everything that reminded him of what he could never be. When Maria Cristina asked for private time with the child, Ferdinand's mind ignited with suspicion. What are they whispering? Are they teaching her to rule without me? Maternal love became subversion. Bonding became sedition. Even lullabies became suspect. The servants suffered next. They were asked to smile in the Queen's presence and report on her the moment she left, to carry her secrets and deliver them to the king. Many broke. They collapsed under the pressure. Stomach ulcers, tremors, weeping in corridors. Turnover rose. New servants entered the palace, unaware of its invisible tripwires, and often triggered Ferdinand's wrath with the smallest, most innocent error. Meanwhile, the king's obsession with Isabella's paternity reached a fever pitch. He commissioned investigations into every man who had ever stood within 10 feet of Maria Cristina in Naples. Hairlines, jaw shapes, eye color. He stared at portraits until the paint seemed to move. He whispered names into the fire, watching them burn. He was no longer seeking truth. He was seeking an enemy worthy of his shame. The investigation never ended. Ferdinand ordered the medical records of every man Maria Cristina had ever met in Naples. He dissected their family histories, their letters, their bloodlines. He wasn't searching for truth. He was searching for guilt. And inside his bedroom, once meant for love and lineage, he built a shrine to failure. Portraits of his 3 dead wives lined the walls, eyes forever open. Medical devices, once tools of hope, now sat idle in dust-covered glass cases. Broken instruments, bent supports, testaments to pain. Crucifixes and relics hung beside them. Gifts from priests, monks, mystics. Objects meant to heal. None had. Visitors who were granted entrance into this space never forgot the smell. Not decay, but desperation. Thick as incense, stuck to the curtains, the wood, the silence. He held meetings here, discussed matters of state beneath oil paintings of women who had died in his bed, issued decrees from a chair flanked by failed instruments of conception. He ruled from a mausoleum of shame, and outside the door, Maria Cristina was breaking. Her hair thinned, her weight shifted, her hands shook. In public, she smiled with regal poise, but her ladies saw the truth. They noted the tremors, the way she flinched at footsteps, the way she constantly turned her head, as if being followed. Because she was. In 1832, Ferdinand's paranoia reached its most grotesque conclusion. He became convinced that Maria Cristina was poisoning him, not through food, but through touch. He believed her skin carried venom, that her kisses, her hands, her very presence was soaked in betrayal. He demanded she undergo medical inspections before any contact. Physicians were summoned. They examined her while he watched. They searched her body for invisible toxins. It was not medicine. It was ritual, a final degradation of whatever remained between them. Maria Cristina bore it all in silence. Outside Spain, the world watched with grim curiosity. European diplomats traded coded reports describing the king's decline. They no longer spoke of policy, only survival. They saw the end coming and began preparing. Some began funding independence movements within Spain. Others pushed for internal fragmentation. Better to see Spain broken into pieces than ruled by a mind already shattered. And then, his body gave out. As 1833 dawned, the tremors grew worse. His digestion failed. His eyes grew vacant. He rambled in speeches, muttering names of enemies who did not exist. He accused the shadows. He blessed his spies. He cursed the walls. Court physicians noted early signs of dementia, though no one dared name it. And the end, after decades of screaming, was almost quiet. Ferdinand VII, the man who ruled from a bed of pain, who obsessed over his bloodline and never truly touched it, began to fade. He did not collapse in battle. He did not die surrounded by heirs. He simply disappeared. One day his words no longer made sense. The next, he could not rise. In his final days, they say he asked to see Isabella. He stared at her, long and silent, and whispered, "Whose child are you?" Really. In his final hours, Ferdinand drifted between shadows. He murmured names, some familiar, some long dead. Orders were issued from his bed, frantic and slurred, commands to investigate plots that never existed, threats to enemies long buried. He called out to his wives, all three, each by name. He asked them for forgiveness, then accused them of betrayal. The palace whispered. Spain held its breath. And then, on a gray day in 1833, Ferdinand VII finally achieved the one peace he had never known in life, through death. The official cause was gout, but palace physicians, those who had tended to his torments for decades, knew the truth. He had died of exhaustion, not just of the body, but of the mind and the soul. He had been drained by a lifetime of unrelieved shame, of sexual failure, of watching a world he could never join pass by from behind the veil of deformity. The autopsy was conducted in secret, behind locked doors, by the very same doctors who had spent their lives trying to fix the king. What they found matched the whispers, and then surpassed them. His anatomy, preserved in meticulous detail, confirmed everything the palace had long hidden. It measured over 14 inches in length and varied grotesquely in girth. Narrow at the base, swollen toward the tip. A shape not seen in textbooks, a thing more creature than human. But that was not the most disturbing finding. Inside, they discovered scarring. Old wounds, healed with time, but never with peace. The records speak of primitive self-surgery, attempts at correction. The king, as a youth, had tried to reshape himself, alone, with blades, with heat, with hope. Each attempt had failed, and each had added pain upon pain, layering trauma into the very tissue of his body. He had been at war with himself for decades. His preserved organ, along with detailed anatomical drawings and written observations, was sealed away. Hidden, locked inside the Vatican archives, church officials declared the material too disturbing and too politically dangerous. It remains there still, a relic of monarchy, a secret too strange for history books. A few scholars allowed rare access described the collection in whispered interviews. Fascinating and horrifying. The body as a battlefield, the mind shattered by flesh. Ferdinand VII died not as a king, but as a caution. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy did not end with him. Instead, it passed into the arms of a child, Isabella II, the daughter who may or may not have been his. She inherited a kingdom already collapsing, civil war, economic ruin, international scorn, and at its heart, a crown still heavy with secrets. The empire that once ruled continents now lay in ruins. Spain, the land of conquistadors, cathedrals, and golden fleets, had been reduced to a flickering candle on the European map. Its decline hastened not by war alone, but by the man who had worn its crown, Ferdinand VII, a king whose private obsessions swallowed his public duty, whose twisted anatomy bled into twisted politics, whose shame, unspoken, unhealed, became a national wound. His reign was not just a failure, it was a disaster sculpted from flesh and paranoia. He ruled not as a monarch of vision, but as a man ruled by fear, by mirrors, by whispers, by the shape of his own body. And through that fear, he destroyed so much more than himself. His 3 wives, each more ghost than queen by the end. His daughter, born of deception, crowned by doubt. His servants, silenced by terror. His people, starved, forgotten, exiled in their own land. All victims of a dynasty too proud to admit it had been broken from the start. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was this: Ferdinand was not merely the villain of his story, he was also its prisoner. A boy born into power he did not understand, trapped in a body he could not control, entrusted with a crown that magnified every flaw into an earthquake. He was not just a king, he was a warning. A reminder that power, when wielded by the damaged, becomes not just dangerous, but contagious. The rot spreads, from bedchamber to throne room, from anatomy to empire. And when the royal physician sealed Ferdinand's preserved organ in a box lined with velvet and wax, he wasn't just archiving a curiosity, he was burying a symbol, a grotesque monument to shame, to control without compassion, to authority without reflection, to the human body turned into a kingdom's curse. That relic remains hidden, deep in the Vatican archives, unseen, unspoken of. And yet, even in darkness it speaks, not of lust, but of legacy, not of scandal, but of sorrow. Ferdinand VII found peace at last in the silence of the grave, but Spain would bleed for generations to come, haunted by a king whose true crown was not made of gold, but of guilt, grief, and grotesque inheritance. A ruler deformed not just in body, but in soul. And history, merciless as it is, remembered him not for what he built, but for everything he broke.